Hello, thank you so much for clicking this video today. I really appreciate it. It's going to be an exciting one. I'm actually here with Phillip, and he's the new CEO of Emurgo. And we're going to learn about Emurgo's strategy moving forward and also learn about the new CEO. So, we talked a little bit last week, and you said you're actually practicing Duolingo.
701 days.
Yeah, that's
my streak.
Yeah, your streak's a lot higher than mine. I think I got to like 60 or so days and then failed it, so I need to restart my streak again. But I have been taking some language classes in person. What language are you learning?
I'm actually learning Korean.
Korean?
Yes, absolutely.
How's it going so far? Is it kind of a hard language or an easier language? What do you think?
It's a big challenge, but it's worth it for the K-dramas.
Yeah. Well, just to jump right into it, how did you end up in this position? What did your career look like before becoming the CEO of Emurgo?
Certainly. Thanks again for the time. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to the community and kind of address some of the things that people have been dying to know. My background is actually pretty straightforward. I came from a traditional finance and consulting background, but ultimately entered into crypto in 2017. I was the president and COO of one of the first licensed regulated centralized exchanges based out of Hong Kong called OSL. After that, I actually went a little bit degen, went down to a DeFi protocol based out of Abu Dhabi. It was actually on Phantom Chain, now Sonic, and experienced what DeFi was like and really enjoyed that experience. Ultimately, I joined Emurgo because I believe in what we're trying to accomplish. We're trying to really commercialize Web3 and bring traditional finance and frankly Web2 into Web3. And I felt like Cardano as an OG chain was a great place to do that.
Yeah, it's nice to see kind of a change in leadership there. And one thing I'm curious about is, what are some of the, kind of key changes, if any were needed, that you think at Emurgo since you've been there? How long have you been there? And also, I wanted to thank you as well for taking the time. I do appreciate it.
No worries. I actually joined Emurgo at the beginning of this year, so it's really in early days.
Yeah.
The key thing with Emurgo, and I think we'll cover a fair amount of these topics during this conversation, is a little bit of the origin story, a little bit of what we've done, but more importantly, where we're going in the future. As the commercial arm of Cardano, and as Cardano's become decentralized, I think it really opens up what Emurgo can do. At the same time, we really need to narrow our focus and really focus on much more high conviction opportunities. It's a real challenge to kind of do everything and do everything well. And I think that's been some fair feedback from the community. And so my goal since joining is really to focus the team on where I think Web3 is going and what is going to really be the next $1 trillion into this space. Specifically, where I believe Web3 is headed is real-world asset tokenization. I actually call it real-world adoption, to be frank. And if you actually think about tokenizing all of financial assets, is a $450 trillion opportunity. All of crypto right now is a little bit over 3 trillion, which is really one Apple stock, right? One single equity. And so for us to really grow and for the community, Web3 community and Cardano specifically to grow, real world asset tokenization is where I think is the strongest opportunity.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you. It does seem like the world is kind of shifting towards bringing real world assets on the blockchain with some clarity around regulation. What does 2025, the rest of 2025 and 2026 look like, for Emurgo, with that kind of RWA focus that you're mentioning?
Yeah, here? I think the three things that are necessary for RWA adoption to really take hold, it's the 3 C's. I try to keep it quite simple. The first one is compliance and regulation, right? So the first C is that, and we're starting to see stablecoin legislation in the U.S., which basically is the government opening up to the concept of crypto and the concept of stablecoins, which is a core primitive that's needed for RWA adoption to take place. For large institutions like a BlackRock or Franklin Templeton to actually enter this space, they need to be able to enter that space in size. Current stablecoin market's roughly 250 billion, which is actually sufficient capacity for large transactions to actually come on chain. The next C that's really required is custody. You need to safe custody these assets. So you have traditional players like Zodia, who are backed by Standard Chartered, who are in the space and offer an incredible custody solution. But you also have Web3 native custody solutions like Coinbase Custody, BitGo, et cetera, who do an amazing job. So that's the next kind of requirement for RWA to really take hold. But the most interesting one is really around composability, right? The ability to actually make assets that are currently potentially not performing perform more effectively. And so composability and programmability of tokenized assets is really what makes adoption happen. Otherwise, you just stay in the traditional finance space, right? And so this is what we can do at Cardano and what we can do in Web3 to really bring these assets on chain.
What if your social profile acted like a stake pool and your followers could stake to you, generating token rewards for you both? What if these token rewards then gave you ownership and voting power in the network itself? Introducing POI, Proof of Influence, a customizable profile ecosystem that displays to the world what matters most to you. A network where its members are validated by each other, forming a community that is risk-rated and incentivized to promote good actors and highlight scammers. A network where you can vote to decide its future and how the underlying technology grows. A social ecosystem built on the most decentralized and secure blockchain network that shares its values and mirrors its design. Mint a testnet profile now on alpha.atrium.io. Complete challenges to level up your profile and receive an ATMA token airdrop when it launches on mainnet. Cardano will never be the same again.
Yeah, and I think that is, one of the biggest use cases ultimately for blockchain. It's kind of having this decentralized database that no one ultimately owns, that, we can, trust our assets, can't be taken by someone, a centralized actor. So, I definitely agree with that big focus. You guys, helped launch USDA, correct?
Yes.
So let's get into that a little bit. How's the launch gone so far? What's the liquidity look like, and kind of what's the future look like for USDA?
Well, thank you for the question. It's actually really insightful. It's actually one of the core primitives that are necessary, again, for RWA adoption to take place. You need a stablecoin, you need liquidity. And in our ecosystem, for better or worse, there are limited options. And so we felt it was really important as Emurgo to really help fill that gap. USDM has done a wonderful job. Obviously they've had a lot of success, but there's room for more because we need more liquidity. So USDA is a partnership that we've made with Encryptus. Encryptus's USP is really the ability to fiat on-ramp and off-ramp across 80 countries almost instantaneously without the use of SWIFT at fees that are incredibly competitive. And we think that is what is going to attract more and more liquidity into the market, because you're able to do things that other stablecoins cannot do. How things are going, it's still early days. We're really happy with the success so far. We've got a lot of partners who are vested in the success of USDA. Waves has been able to provide some degree of liquidity as well. We're cresting past 8 figures and growing quite quickly. It's integrated into a number of swaps already, and we plan to continue to support it with the help of the community, of course.
Yeah, I do agree with the fact that we do need multiple stable coins. I mean, if you've been looking at, kind of USDC, there's been some worry on other chains that the control, that USDC or USDT would have, over a proof of stake blockchain when they have so much liquidity on that blockchain. So I hope to see USDA and USDM ultimately succeed, and I actually hope to see more liquidity from other stable coins. Imagine, a world where the stable coin that we're using is a mix of, USDM and USDA and maybe a third and a fourth alternative. So, definitely happy to see you guys, come out with that. Are there any other kind of, large, kind of partnerships, kind of with this DePen real world asset focus, that are, maybe have come out recently, or will come out soon?
Certainly. The other one that we have launched, and it's actually the largest single kind of asset out there, which is gold, right? So Kinka is a project that we've worked on and helped bring tokenized gold into Cardano through a strong partner based out of Japan where they're listed and licensed and regulated, which gives a degree of safety and security for any of the folks in our ecosystem to have trust in purchasing Kinka tokens, ultimately representing ounces of gold. We've also had conversations on how we can make that more composable. Right, so if you think of gold as ostensibly a non-performing asset, right, you're just waiting for the asset price to grow, it actually costs you money to custody it. Right? So in some ways, Warren Buffett will often say he doesn't hold gold because it doesn't do anything for him. If you tokenize gold and you make it composable and you make it so that you could actually lend or borrow against it and then take those funds and reinvest potentially in the ecosystem or in higher performing assets, now you take a non-performing asset and turn it into potentially a performing asset. And we think that is really an incredible use case for something that in the traditional world really doesn't do much. Right? Although gold price obviously has appreciated in the last little while. So those are the types of things that we're thinking about. And beyond that, we're having conversations with firms like DigiFT where they would be open to potentially listing that type of asset on a real world asset exchange. Because it's regulated, because it's listed, because it's licensed at the underlying, there's a lot of trust there. And so that's really critical in any community and in our space, that there's trust and there's security and safety behind it. So that would be a specific example that we're big believers in.
Yeah, definitely. I'm kind of excited to see a little bit of gold on chain. The past, I would say, year has been very interesting, for Cardano. There's been years of development, on chain, and also kind of social development around the world, with workshops and, all of that, led to a constitution being signed in Argentina, and then after that, the DREPs ratified that on chain. They voted on a roadmap now, and recently, DREPs have been, kind of voting on a budget, and then now the budget's on chain. So what, from your perspective, you mentioned, you started at Emurgo earlier this year, so you haven't seen kind of the whole process. But what are your thoughts so far on kind of, the Cardano's kind of first steps into full decentralization through the community and also the intersect process?
Yeah, that's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
But I think it's a very, very fair question. I think if you zoom out and you ask yourself, as someone who's been in Web3 for some time, I think both of us have been in the space for a number of cycles. If you ask yourself how many L1s have been around for more than 5 years with a market cap above 5 billion that has not had a security flaw and has consistently been running 24/7 since the beginning, there are almost no other chains than Cardano, right? So we often beat ourselves up about why is there not more development on chain? Why is it not bigger than it is? But the practical reality is we've accomplished an enormous amount. As an outside person looking into the different L1s out there, it's one of the reasons why I was attracted to the opportunity to help lead Emurgo. Now, as we've gone through decentralization, again, tell me another chain that has had the confidence in the community to actually burn Genesis keys and actually put the power in the hands of a member-based organization like Intersect. There isn't any, right? So we are ostensibly the most decentralized, high market cap, OG chain out there that is actually moving forward in an ethos that Web3 supports, full decentralization. So I think that's incredibly exciting. That comes with growing pains. It comes with a lot of challenges. It comes with a lot of heated debates, a lot of passionate people. And I think that's actually, again, a positive. People care enough to argue their case, to scream at the top of their Twitter lungs, right, of what they truly believe. And then there are others who will say what they believe. And I think that is a positive outcome when you zoom out. Having constructive discourse over Twitter is a challenge. I don't think that's what anyone expects, right? But I do think people see it as a way for them to share what they think. And I think there's a lot of DREPs who've spent an enormous amount of time, enormous amount of attention to do their very best to properly represent what they believe Cardano should be, and the people who delegate to them that they feel obligation and responsibility to do the same. So for me, while the process has been in some ways eye-opening, in some ways frustrating, I'm sure for many, I do see progress being made. And I think that is the key. I think we need to have a little bit more patience with Intersect and the MBO, and the newly elected members as well, who I'm sure will bring in new energy. But I also do believe that they need to be more clear in their position and their role as either facilitators or as communicators or information providers, so that the community really understands what they should count on Intersect to do. Similarly, I think I'm sure we'll talk about the founding entities roles. And I'd love to cover that, but certainly we'll let you direct what you'd like to know from that perspective.
Yeah, no, I think that's kind of a great pivot. What do you think, the role of Emurgo is, in the past and moving forward in the ecosystem?
Yeah, I wanted to give you a hot take, and I'm really grateful for your time and the fact that you reached out. So I really wanted to share something, for the first time. Based on community feedback and based on my analysis of where things are at, I've recommended to the team, and they're in the process of doing it already, of taking Emurgo's Genesis ADA out of our DREPs and actually delegate those, that amount to other DREPs, frankly, and not DREPs that support everything that we do. We're actually going to delegate it across a number of DREPs, some of whom may actually disagree with us, and we're okay with that. Some of whom are more commercially minded, but again, the vote is in their hands, not in our hands. So, the hot take right now is Emurgo's Genesis ADA will not be in our DREPs, Emurgo DREP and Uroi DREP.
Okay, yeah, I think that's great news. I think the founding entities are kind of, taking different perspectives on how ought they vote. And, with Cardano's decentralization being fresh and new, it's nice to see kind of a change in opinion. I did a podcast in Argentina with Charles in December, and I asked him, kind of a similar question, are you guys going to be voting with Genesis ADA? And he said, no, the Cardano Foundation is voting with Genesis ADA. So that's, essentially 2 out of 3 not voting. I would say, around specifically voting and the budget process and Intersect, the other biggest, criticism that I've seen from the community has been around, really the user experience in Uroi and the promoting of delegation to the Uroi DREP, and then kind of mixing in with that the fact that there's 2 different types of DREPs, 2 different sets of DREP keys essentially. So, was there any kind of thought of, I am actually building a platform, and when we do user experience, we think a lot about education, and we also think about kind of guiding users, right? And to me, it seems like, the way Uroi is designed and built, it's guiding users specifically to delegate directly to the Uroi DREP. And, I've been in Cardano since, 2017. And, I've made countless videos where I've told people to download Uroi. I've probably onboarded,
Thank you, by the way.
Yeah, over 10,000 people, I would guess, that I've onboarded, through YouTube videos, maybe even more. And, a lot of those users, even though they don't check in on Cardano every day, or they're not arguing with us on X, they still have ADA. They're still checking their Uroi sometimes, especially with new news like the Brave announcement.
Amazing. And Trust Wallet.
Yeah, and Trust Wallet. So, seeing announcements like that, they're logging back in, they're seeing the word DREP for the first time, and then they're like, oh, well, to claim my staking rewards now, I have to delegate to a DREP. Well, I've always used Uroi, and they just click the button. So there's like kind of a lack of education around, I think what a DREP even is, what they're even doing, and it definitely seems like there's a perfect, user experience path to guide them directly to delegate their voting power to you. And I think that is really one of the fairest criticisms that's been raised so far, about Emurgo in governance as it launches on Cardano.
Yeah, I think we're open to the feedback, right? As I've stated on X, I actually give the community a fair amount of credit on how they think about these things. It is an affirmative consent. They are clicking to choose to delegate. Now, I still understand the criticism from the community. So I've actually gone back to our head of product and said, look, how can we make it still possible to delegate to us? Because I think it's fair to do so, but perhaps, reduce the obviousness, as they say, of the streaming to a click to DREP. And so that's underway right now. So we're going to be looking at that. So we take the feedback from the community. At the same time, I know that in this process, of delegation, it's really important for the DREPs to be transparent about their platform. Much like a politician, we support these themes. We are more likely than not to vote for those themes. And these are themes that we are less supportive of, and we're more likely not to vote for those themes. And I think that's something that will evolve over time as DREPs become more well-known and more well-known on their platforms. I think up until now, there is a degree of trust, whether people feel it's fully earned or not, with Cardano Foundation, with Emurgo, with IOG, with folks like yourself, folks like Cardano Whale, folks like Cardano Yoda, and Jane, who are clearly thoughtful, intelligent, articulate folks who actually have the community and Cardano, in their view, in the best of intentions. And so they naturally become the people that people delegate to.
Yeah.
And so I think that we need to actually respect that as well. If people are actively deciding to delegate to Emurgo or delegate to yourself or delegate to Jane. We also talked earlier about when we feel that that amount of power and that amount of control might be too much for an individual. And you've made a statement that should we consider reducing that impact, right? And the truth is, I think over time, Emurgo will actually step further away from day-to-day governance and put that power in the hands of Intersect and DREPs like yourself. To expect that to happen on the first major governance action post-decentralization, I don't think that's necessary. I think for us, we care a lot about the success of Cardano, as much or more than anyone else. And so having us actively participate, having IOG actively participate, having Cardano Foundation actively participate, I think is an overall net positive. But I do believe over time, our DREP power should actually be decentralized and be less. I actually believe that it's very important for that to happen. Right now, if you look at the rankings of DREPs, certain DREPs ostensibly can become kingmakers. If I chose to acquire or put to work over 1 billion ADA, I could actually stop things from happening. And under the current construct, I'm entitled to do so. And I think that's something that we as a community need to think through. For us, we will over time reduce our voting power and put that into a more decentralized set of constituents. But that'll take a little bit of time. But that's also why we have a pretty open voting system. So people can question, criticize, ask for further clarification on why we voted for what we voted for, and if people feel like we're voting for projects and protocols that are going to benefit, us disproportionately. And I think that's okay. People should be able to ask those questions. We should be able to answer those questions equally, which is why I'm here today.
Yeah, I do appreciate you being here. I think that, even though we operate on a trustless blockchain, I think we still live in a trusted society. I think that people don't have time to keep up with all of the changes to Intersect every day, or they don't have time to keep up with all of the hard forks. And they kind of believe in the vision that Cardano offers, and they believe in the future of blockchain. And I think that they kind of look to people, which is essentially what you're doing by delegating to a DREP, kind of to stay in touch with all of this for them. And I think that the UI and UX doesn't really speak to that in your ROI. Specifically, you kind of mentioned, I think that's a good point. DREPs should kind of say what they believe in, almost like a politician. When you delegate to me, this is essentially what you can expect from me. It doesn't really say that in your ROI. I looked at the screenshot of it. I had it pulled up, and it just says, it's a square that's really big, and it says, delegate to your ROI. You are delegating your DREP to your ROI. And then there's a smaller box below that where you choose a DREP, and then there's another one that says it's smaller, and it says like auto abstain, right? And to me, that doesn't really allude to the community trusting your ROI as their DREP, in my opinion. And you mentioned, there being large DREPs in the ecosystem that can push their weight. Before the Genesis ADA was removed, which I'm happy to see. The total voting power right now, I think, is 11.2% of all of the DREP voting power on Cardano is in those two DREP, Emurgo and your ROI. So it's nice to kind of see that step in the right direction. But from our perspective, I think education really is at the key of all of this. It's at the forefront.
Correct.
Whereas if those users were knowledgeable when they were delegating to Yoroi, I think that you make a fair point, but I would go as far to say that they're not. From my experience speaking to users in this community, you brought up Jane. Jane's very intelligent. A lot of the DREPs are very intelligent. But your everyday person is working a 40, 60 hour week. They're going home to their family and they're maybe watching 1 or 2 YouTube videos a week and they're invested in this ecosystem. And the only time that they check in is when there's a big news announcement. And those people, were not educated by Yoroi when they made that delegation, and that has led to kind of a lopsided power in this ecosystem. With that being said, I do think it's very valuable to have strong founding entities because, a lot of, companies in Cardano are just startups with little capital, with little business experience. So I've liked, I've really, Frederick Gergard, for example, I did an interview with him, a couple of months after he came on to CF, and I've watched his growth. He's kind of turned the Cardano Foundation into an entity that I think does a lot of valuable things to Cardano. Although I don't agree with everything they do, I think they're valuable. They kind of, they will do good for the Cardano blockchain. And I think that, we could see the same thing happen here. With you kind of coming onto Emurgo, with you guys, launching some of these assets. But I think to me it is very obvious that there is, kind of an ethical fault in the way that Yoroi is designed and pushes people directly to delegate to them. And I think that if I did that in my platform that I'm developing, it would be wrong, and I'm not an official wallet. Because when I advertised Yoroi and Daedalus to my followers or my people on X or YouTube, I said, this was made by the creators of Cardano. This is made by the founding entity.
Correct.
And I think because of that Genesis ADA, there's some belief that they've already kind of been paid in a way. Like that, future stuff, there should be capital that comes to founding entities for future things. But I think that light wallet was kind of integral in the beginning of Cardano.
Sure.
That's where people staked ADA for the first time.
Sure. Yeah.
So that's kind of my thoughts.
No, look, I think it's really important to share your views, right? And I think it's important for us to listen to the community. So that's why I stated at the very beginning, not only were we removing Genesis ADA, but I actually spoke with our head of product to actually revisit that, to make it a little bit more of a freer choice, even though I believe it is a free choice, but to make it a bit more of a freer choice where it doesn't feel like people are being funneled into a decision, right? And so that's underway.
Okay, I think that's fair.
Yeah.
And I think that what everyone needs to do ultimately is just try to educate those people that aren't checking in every day.
Correct.
When I make content like this, that's kind of why I mentioned the process so far, is because people that have been here for a while are ultimately checking in. So could we kind of see that one day within Yoroi, kind of like education around DREPs or around delegation, how to participate in governance ultimately?
We actually have done some of that. We've also put together a commercial roadmap which said what we believe in, right? And so we actually really care about education. We really feel that's important. I think this process, which I think where we all can agree has been somewhat truncated, quite rushed in many members' views. Like as a DREP, to be able to review 194 or 200 plus projects over a long weekend, literally, was a lot to ask of people, right? And for those who were brave enough to take that on and actually start posting their points of view, their DMs were full, potentially for projects where they voted no to or abstained or didn't vote yes to. And so, from my perspective, this is the first time we've gone through it. We should take the lessons learned, the feedback from the community on what could be improved, and more transparency on what a DREP will do and what a DREP is, particularly as a founding entity with that weight and that responsibility, to do a better job. And you certainly have our commitment to do that. We'll spend more time on showing what the Yoroi platform as a DREP will vote on, again, without Genesis ADA attached to it. So anything that is mandated with a let's call it a fair delegation process, should give us a mandate to vote on those things that are commercial. And that's our mandate as Emurgo. We also certainly vote on a lot of the technical requirements that we know are necessary. And having an advocate like IOG and obviously Charles continuing to support Cardano is incredibly important for our long-term success. And as you know, Frederick has really, I think, done an amazing job kind of turning Cardano Foundation into a real powerhouse. A lot of the things that they do are not as well known to the community because they're longer tail items, working with larger institutions that take time for adoption. But long story short, feedback well taken. So we're going to take out Genesis Eta. We're going to make it a fair delegation process within Yoroi. We still want people to choose to delegate. We are a known brand, and that's really important for people who do check in from time to time to know that we're going to consistently be X, right? We're not going to change our minds over time, right? We are going to consistently be focused on the commercial adoption of Cardano, right? And so for some people who may be single issue voters, that's all they want. And that's okay. And we shouldn't criticize people for delegating because they're single issue voters. Not everyone is going to look at 194 proposals and really care about which one they say yes or no to. Some will just go, I want the technical roadmap and I'm good. And they delegate to those DREPs who care about that and are passionate about that. And some will delegate to folks who are more commercially focused and that's what they care about. And so I think that's really important. But, we're going to make some of those changes. Now, as it relates to education and ensuring that, our stance and frankly, other DREPs should take on that responsibility, much like yourself, on what they stand for and what this process is around governance and the importance of governance and the risk actually of centralized power within a decentralized governance process. And we can look at the league table. We're not the largest DREP, right? Even in aggregate. We really need to think about that.
Yeah.
And so that is definitely part of what we plan to do going forward, based on the feedback from the community.
Yeah, well, it is nice to see your willingness to hear community feedback. Ultimately, you mentioned DREPs kind of needing to have these pillars. Kind of what they believe in. You mentioned that there's two different DREPs, specifically the Yoroi one and the Emurgo one. Do these DREP different keys? Do they have essentially different pillars that they believe in, that they're going to vote on, or will they all kind of vote in a similar manner because they're ultimately controlled by the same entity?
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly fair question. I look at it from the perspective of, how things have been constructed create a scenario where there's not a lot of ability to be actually nuanced in our voting. And that's the same for every major DREP, every DREP in the top 20, for example. If they really have three choices: yes, no, or abstain. And if you have 1 billion ADA or 100 million ADA, it's the same three choices. And ultimately, those have material impacts on the success or failure of projects, protocols that are asking for funding, right? They may or may not believe, that we may or may not believe are the right things, right? So for us, having two DREPs is actually beneficial in some ways because we have some nuance, a little bit more control over how we influence outcomes. I don't think it's healthy for an ecosystem where a single DREP can put so much weight on a protocol that it ultimately makes it either all the other DREPs need to support the opposite point of view to stop it, or all the other DREPs who have the opposite point of view to pass it. Right? Now that's something that we as a community and Intersect as an entity, a governing body, needs to really think about. And it's hard. These are really difficult things. I wouldn't expect us out the gate to have it done perfectly or have it done right. There's many, many unintended consequences that happen as a result of brands. Much like you shared, very fairly, Yoroi is deemed an official wallet because it's from the founding entity, one of the founding entities. And so, the feedback we received is people will delegate to you because there's a lot of trust as a founding entity. And it may not be easy not to delegate it to continue to benefit from certain things, right, in their view. And so we have to respond to that. We have to understand that, as a founding entity, how do we ensure that we're seen as equitable, right? And that's my job. So what I've done is I've removed Genesis Eta, and I'm going to commit to reviewing the UI UX process to ensure that it is a fair choice. And I think the same thing should be said for other major DREPs, right? I'm sure many of them actually don't necessarily want that much power and control over it. They'd rather it be shared more broadly, right? So that when they vote on certain things that maybe you are passionate for, not as a single issue voter, but a multi-issue voter, and you vote for something, but maybe a significant portion of your delegated ADA actually don't agree with that. How do you handle that? How do we handle that, right? And I think that's something that the current structure doesn't solve for, right? I have a number of ideas on how it could work, but that still is a community decision. So imagine a world where I had, I think we have roughly 540 million ADA under the 2 DREPs. Imagine it was just a budget. I can vote for a project or initiative, and I spend my budget down. So my 540 or my 300 and 240 are not always used each time. So if I support your project and I spend 50 million ADA to vote for it, I now have 490 million ADA left to vote for the other projects. That, to me, might be a better way of reducing my overall power. I actually need to think about where I spend my ADA, my delegated ADA power, across 200 projects, versus just putting 540, 300, 240, and just multiple times. It feels to me like that may result in some of the criticism that all of us face as large DREPs.
Yeah, and I think that we will see improvements and changes as we have with Catalyst.
Of course.
They're moving to quadratic voting
Exactly.
in the next round.
Exactly.
And, I think that it's a good idea. Ultimately, I think it's going to make people with less ADA have more of an impact, but without hurting people that have invested quite a bit
Exactly.
into the ecosystem. So the budget is on chain right now.
Yes.
It's 275 million ADA, I think, is the total. And from what I understand, this isn't a treasury withdrawal. This is a budget info action.
Correct.
And this budget info action, once it's passed, then the line items or the proposals that are within the budget are able to be submitted again for a treasury withdrawal.
Yes.
Right.
Which requires 67% support.
Exactly. And then this one's only over 50.
Correct.
Right? It's 51%. Or,
Correct.
Okay.
To the best of my knowledge, yes.
Yeah, and same here. So, still learning this stuff as it comes out, to be honest with you guys. So, are you guys, what do you think of that 275 million budget? Is that kind of in the range that you were hoping for?
Yeah.
Are you guys going to vote yes on this info action?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've actually thought about this a lot. I believe very strongly that if people that I respect, who have been committed to the community for much longer than I have, I'm relatively new to this community, right, are passionate about spending less, we need to think about and internalize why, right? And so I've kind of moderated my view. As a commercial entity, obviously I feel like we need to invest in the ecosystem, we invest in projects that are going to bring TVL and transaction volume on chain, which ultimately will replenish the treasury over time. And for what it's worth, Cardano needs to do a better job of attracting not just homegrown users, but also projects and protocols that exist on other chains. You see from Midnight, Charles, myself, and frankly, I think most people realize there's no one chain to rule all, right? Interoperability, multi-chain is the future, right? Single purpose chains can even come into play. And so when I look at the 275 million, I actually asked Intersect, I said, okay, let's just be clear about something. This is a 12-month budget process. This is not to 2025. So this is not 275 million hypothetically being spent within the next 6 calendar months. This is over the next 12 months, right? So that's bullet 1. Bullet 2 is it still requires a 67% info action to ultimately withdraw these funds. Bullet 3 is if ADA's at 80 cents or ADA's at $1 or ADA's at 50 cents, I think we should have the ability to moderate how much ADA is actually released. All of these budget actions were considered under 50-cent ADA.
Yeah.
ADA is now, last time I checked, 80-something cents. So in my view, that 275 is much smaller already, right? And that actually should, play into the views of some of the more conservative DREPs on how much they want to spend. And so there's a lot of very straightforward things that I think if the DREPs were in a room, for example, to talk it through, would actually agree on. But because we don't necessarily have an easy forum for DREPs to communicate collectively, we end up having people speaking past one another on Twitter or on X. And I think that's the biggest challenge for us, right? And this is the role that I think Intersect needs to play. Intersect needs to go out there, which I have, but they need to consistently go out there and say, this is a 12-month budget. This was done with ADA at 50 cents. Would the community support that if ADA's at 80 cents, obviously the amount of ADA that we distribute should be reduced? I think every DREP would say yes to that. Mm-hmm. And if you do that already, you're talking ADA at 80 versus ADA at 50. That's roughly 67% higher than what it currently is. So you do the math, we're probably close to 200 million on the NCL, which is what's being voted on right now, right? And so it's quite, I think sensible people, when they do that type of math, will realize that we're actually not far apart, right? But there isn't anyone out there who is neutral to say, here's our interpretation of what is actually happening, and here's what we would do if ADA's at 80 cents, and put it out there. And that, I think, is Intersect's role as a facilitator, not as someone who is going to influence things one way or another, but simply to state, this is what our understanding is. And would the large DREPs, and frankly all DREPs, support this? I think very quickly we'd acquiesce around that and move forward. Because the danger we have right now with all these new NCLs is we're simply delaying the release of funding for core projects and core technology upgrades that we require to be competitive, right? And so that's my concern, which is why we voted yes at 350, we voted yes at 275, and we voted no on the subsequent NCL budgets that have come forward, because we have so many gates to protect the Treasury before any dollar comes out. And even once the 67% threshold is actually met, they're milestone based, so they're not going to get the full amount right away. And so there's so many ways for us to protect the sanctity of that Treasury and the importance of maintaining that and ensuring that it lasts for multiple cycles. Right? We've seen many chains, spend away. I think we've already got those gates, and I really would love to sit in a room with the other DREPs and really talk through it and say, what are the fears? What are the concerns? What are the gates that we have? And as you've both of us have said, we're still learning. We're still trying to understand this. And I think some of these fears are manifesting themselves in ways that are not productive.
Yeah, I think that you can definitely say that. And, I am one of those people kind of advocating for spending less, and it's for a few reasons. I mean, just to be quite honest, one of the reasons is Intersect. It is the way this whole process has gone down. I mean, we were originally supposed to, essentially vote on different budgets that were from different communities that were in brackets, and then now we're all voting on this one thing, but CLIs aren't, CLI keys aren't supported, and now there's a week to use this new tool. All the old voting was done.
Yes.
So, I think that, there is some reason, to argue for spending less, especially if you look at, the macro environment and the change of regulation in the U.S. As far as the 275, I personally haven't voted on it. I can kind of see some reason for both sides, and ultimately I need to think a little bit more on it. But if you look at people living under their governments, like what brought a lot of us to blockchain in the first place is useless spending, kind of abroad, or useless spending on on people that don't need it in countries. So I think that's kind of the big worry there, and with a lot of the mistakes that have happened so far, not just with Intersect, but with lack of education around DREP delegation, what a DREP even is, what your role is, etc. I think that it's fair to have that reluctance with some of time that's been spent in the real world by the individuals that are ultimately having these opinions. A couple of proposals that I was excited to see specifically was Cardano having more of a presence at events, the unified events front.
Yeah, sure.
So I, for example, here at Consensus, there is no Cardano booth. And to be honest, over the past 4 or 5 years, I'm not even placing the blame on Emurgo at all, but I've really, been kind of upset about that. We had a booth, I think, in 2021, and it brought everybody out. All of the projects were here. They were networking with other communities. You walk in there right now, there's a Polkadot booth that's demoing other projects in the ecosystem. Founders are there, and those founders are networking, making deals, making partnerships. And we've never had that for Cardano. So that's kind of why I voted yes on that unified events proposal. So what is that? You guys, Emurgo, is kind of teaming up essentially. It's Emurgo, CF, Intersect, and then the Rare team.
Yes.
So what what's that going to look like? What's the presence at Cardano events going to look like? Moving forward, and are there ways for users in the community and projects or founders within the community to kind of be a part of this unification of the Cardano events front?
Yeah. Again, I think it's incredibly important that we collaborate and coordinate across the different constituencies and entities within their Cardano ecosystem.
Yes.
There are certain participants like Rare Evo who are amazing at what they do, and they have a strength in North America. Emurgo, we're headquartered in Singapore. We have been global. We've run over 70 plus events since establishment across the world as sponsors, really trying to represent Cardano and Emurgo and many of the other projects and protocols that fall under that umbrella. Concentrating and coordinating that spend, I think, is going to be the most effective use of treasury dollars. It doesn't mean that Emurgo is not going to spend its own treasury on supplementing, on adding to, on side events, on hosting, founders at dinners, those types of things. We do, and we have done so for 9 years since existence. But having a very transparent budget, a very clear KPI'd objectives where we can hang a singular flag of Cardano out into the ecosystem, out into events like Consensus, Token 2049, et cetera, I think is probably the smartest way for us to do that. And we're really grateful that the community ultimately passed it and folks like yourself supported it with real questions, right? What are we going to get for it? What are the KPIs? How will founders be able to benefit from this umbrella? The builders that are actually bringing value to the ecosystem, bringing value to our layer one, how can they leverage that, right? And I think those are things that we feel are really important of having this unified budget. Now I'm actually going to kind of do something that I probably shouldn't do, but there are people who obviously opposed it or people who've proposed alternative budgets, right? We actively will reach out to them and say, how can we do this under a unified fashion? The key thing for us, and I think the key thing for this whole budget process, we don't want to have duplication, right? But we want to have competition, right? It shouldn't just be that because we're a founding entity or because Rare Evo, has the track record that it has, that we automatically are the ones that will be, the flag bearers for Cardano. There are others in the ecosystem that do a great job as well. We know that it's important for us to collaborate then. And we've reached out, and I'd love to be able to do so again. Even if their projects were not approved or their marketing wasn't approved, we're still happy to engage and say, how can you be part of this? How can we, maybe subsidize a side event to ensure that there's a different voice, maybe a different narrative, maybe something that we don't see as a founding entity or as, the broad theme things that we're focused on. There's so many things to cover, right? So let's say Emurgo is focused on RWA. Well, there's plenty that may focus on the, social network side of things or focus on other elements within the Cardano ecosystem that needs some presence, needs a place to meet and hang out and talk. We'd love to have those conversations because if we are here in consensus, we've spent a fair amount of money to do that. And with that, you often get additional value, additional benefits that we could make available to the community. And I think that's what we're really trying to do. When you have a sizable budget to sponsor at the large flagpole, tentpole events, they really do cater to our requests, right? And I think that's really what we want to do. Spreading it out where we're all small, bronze sponsors, basically dilutes our power.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I hope to see Cardano kind of have a larger impact at these events because, people don't realize how large our community is or how many founders there are, or as you mentioned, the 24/7 uptime and there being few blockchains. So, I think that coming to these events will kind of change that narrative. Again, I appreciate you taking the time to do this podcast. Is there anything that, we didn't cover so far that you kind of wanted to get out there to the Cardano community before we head out of here today?
Look, I'm really grateful for the opportunity. this isn't the last one. I'd love to keep in touch at the next event, have a follow-up, right? We're going to be hosting a Spaces, and actually happy for it to be very open and to take some of the tougher questions that I know the community would really like to know about. It's going to be ongoing. You're seeing a new Emurgo emerge, not to kind of use alliteration, but you're seeing a new Emurgo emerge. We are going to be really focused on things that we think will make a difference, and those are going to be commercially focused. They're going to be both Cardano kind of DNA based, but also think a lot about multi-chain. I know that may not be something that some members of the community want to hear, but I really do believe a multi-chain world is where we're headed. Midnight is an example of that. That obviously Charles is leading. So stay tuned for his Spaces. Fred and I talk regularly from the Cardano Foundation. We actually talk about co-hosting a space. So we're going to be a little bit more transparent to the community about what we're doing, how we want to make an impact, where we can work together, and we respect the open dialogue.
Awesome. Well, again, yeah, thank you guys all for tuning in and watching. If you have any questions, make sure you comment them down below. If you made it till the end, put Emerging Emurgo to let us know you made it till the end in the comments section. But yeah, again, thank you so much for taking the time, and let's definitely do it again.
Definitely. Thanks.